let's be honest, every painting is better when it has a cat in it. Welcome back to Digital Painting Fundamentals. Let's talk about how to handle complicated layer structures to maximize your efficiency, as well as some other general tips to make your pieces even stronger. So let's jump right in. First up, we have an assignment from Chris. You've got a great handle on your value control and have done an excellent job separating the darker clothes from the lighter skin in the background. Your layer structure is looking quite strong too. It looks like you've kept the body, the hair, the clothing, and the hat all on their own layer. One thing I noticed is that it does look like we have a bit of the same issue here, where the hair is painted above the body layer, and you've erased out the parts of the hair that are overlapped by the body itself. This isn't inherently wrong, as it does look correct in the final painting, but you're potentially setting yourself up for some struggle if at any point in the future you find that you have to move the arm, either rotating it or changing the pose or really adjusting it at all, and suddenly you'll have this big empty space where the hair was originally wrapping around the silhouette of the arm. This is where using in-depth layer structures can get tricky, because there's not always an easy one-size-fits-all solution for these kinds of problems. There's a lot of different ways you could address this difficult situation, and I'll show you a couple of my favorites. The first off is, if you really want to keep your character's body all on one layer, you can have the face and the arm on their own layer, and I would then recommend painting the hair out in full on its own layer. Then, rather than erasing out the parts of the body that overlap with the hair, which will leave you with these odd empty gaps should you ever change the position of the body, I would recommend using a layer mask instead, where you can add a layer mask, and on the mask itself, you can remove the parts of the body that need to be overlapped, and then if you end up changing the body in the future, you can simply delete the layer mask and repaint it, and you won't have to repaint all the hair underneath because that's already been solved and the information is contained on its own layer. The other way you could handle it, which is a little bit more complicated but a lot more flexible, is to simply use more layers and basically get to the point where you're creating a layer for every single plane of visual space in the image. For instance, if I were painting this piece, I would likely have the entire face on its own layer, and I would use that layer as an opportunity to be sure that I've drawn out the nose and the mouth, at least roughly, and be sure that the proportions of my face are correct. On top of that, I would probably have a hair layer. Similar to what I showed previously, I would paint the hair in full, going all the way around and behind the figure. The hair that goes behind the face itself, I might keep that on a separate layer and be sure that it's behind the layer of my face. That way, if I ever need to change the contour of the face, I don't also have to repaint the hair behind it. Then on top of these layers, I could add in the hat, as well as the clothing, and keeping the clothing on its own layer already solves my problem and puts the hair falling behind the figure like it's supposed to be. And finally, on top of all those different layers, I would paint the forearm that's so drastically overlapping a bunch of elements of the character. You could include the sword on this layer or separate it out onto its own layer. This might seem like a lot of work and a lot of layers, but on more complicated characters doing complicated poses, you'll oftentimes have to start adjusting your posing and your proportions to get things to look right, especially if you're working from imagination. So having a really robust layer structure that allows you to make those edits easily, rather than trying to mess and mangle with a couple much simpler layers, is ultimately going to make your life a lot easier. If you haven't watched the lesson this critique is referencing, check it out and try the assignment for yourself at proko.com/666. Next, we have these assignments from Nicole. Very nice work overall here, and props to you for doing all 3 assignments. I'm especially loving the changes you made to the first assignment, because, let's be honest, every painting is better when it has a cat in it. Overall, these paintings are looking really good. You've got a great grasp on your value control and are very clearly separating your light and your dark shapes, which makes these super easy to read. Your layer structures are looking good as well. It looks like you've separated pretty much everything on the character onto its own layer, which can be helpful depending on the kind of assignment you're working on. The same thing is going on with the second demo down here, And I really love the creative liberty that you took with this new outfit on the second edited version. Overall, this piece is in a great place, so I just have a couple suggestions to try to push it a little bit further. They have less to do with inaccuracies to the reference and more to do with deviating a little from the reference to make a better painting. The first thing I would note is that the folds on this sleeve are getting a little bit dark and distracting, and while they do appear that way in the reference, this is something that you can easily manipulate in your paintings to get a clearer read and nicer values going on. The areas I would take a look at are mainly these exceptionally dark folds here, and also we're kind of missing the form of the arm up here. Remember that even though it's covered in fabric, this arm is still a cylinder going away from us in space, and we're kind of missing the shadow side of the fabric over here. These are pretty easy fixes overall, something you can easily adjust with a soft brush. And a lot of this just comes down to being sure that your smaller secondary forms are conforming more to the larger primary forms that they're sitting on top of. So even though these folds do have some light and shadow and dimension to them, it's generally better in painting to try and simplify those things a little bit and be sure that you're getting the overall read of the larger form, which in this case is a cylinder. In addition to reinforcing the larger forms, reducing some of the contrast of these folds on the sleeve helps to keep focus in the area that we really want it to be, which is, in most cases, the portrait. I would also do something similar with the rim light down here. Although it is fairly bright in the reference, that's another area that I would consider stylizing, just to be sure that the shadow values don't start breaching into the value range of the lights. It's a subtle change, but you can see that that arm starts to look a lot more three-dimensional if we put a little less emphasis on the folds of the fabric and a little more emphasis on the cylinders of the arm. Another really small note I would make is on this particular shape right here, the shadow side of this fold. Although it's accurate to the reference, it's a little dull as a shape, and it's in a pretty prominent area of the figure, so it's worth maybe stylizing a little bit for more oomph. Generally speaking with shape design, you kind of want to try to avoid things that are too parallel and even. If we can taper this shape in one direction or the other, we'll get a much more interesting design out of the fabric. There's a couple ways you could solve this. We also have a bit of a shape issue with this shadow and this light area being almost exactly the same size and width. We haven't really talked about shape design that much in this course, but it's worth digging into a little bit as we start getting more advanced with our paintings. A super simple fix for this would be to make one side of this particular fold a little bit larger than the other, as well as look into tapering the shadow in some way. I feel like the shadow looks better if it's a little larger towards the collar, and then we could either taper it out towards the bottom of the shadow, or we could potentially even split that into two separate shadows. In this case, I think keeping it as one shadow is a little simpler and more appealing, so we'll go with that here. I can also reduce the contrast here a touch, and maybe wrap a little shadow around the left side. We can also get a slightly more concrete cast shadow from the arm, kind of falling over this fabric. It's pretty subtle in the reference, but if you look close, there is actually a hard edge right here where the raised arm is blocking the light source from hitting the shirt. There's a fair amount of ambient light in the room, so the shadow is still fairly luminous, but creating that shape I think gives us a nice little separation, and we can then even further design this fold to almost create an arrow that points us directly back towards the face. I would also consider personally deviating from the reference on the shadow side of the shirt. Although you've captured the values correctly, I feel like you can get a little bit more atmosphere by just letting that really sit back and almost fade away into the background. A similar thing with the bottom of the pants here. If we get a little bit of gradient going on here, we can really reinforce that we've got a nice sort of tucking cylindrical form to the bottom of the pant legs as they fall into shadow while they tuck into the boots. Speaking of falling into shadow and melting into the background, One potential disadvantage to building your piece with so many layers is that often you'll end up with very hard edges across the entire painting because you've spent so much time separating things out cleanly. This isn't to say that you shouldn't separate things out cleanly, but I find it helpful to go back after the fact and try to look for areas where it would be nice to soften edges. In this case, I think you could get a lot of mileage out of softening the edges on the shadow side of the figure. Generally speaking, we want edges that are in the light, important, or close to us to be a little harder and more in focus, and edges that are in the shadow, less important, or far away from us can generally be a little softer. I personally really like the smudge tool for this purpose, and it works great because even if you have things separated onto layers, you can still use the smudge tool to soften the edges and get a nice effect of atmosphere. I would maybe even look into softening the edges of the collar as it falls into shadow, as you can really get a lot of nice atmosphere by letting some of these details melt together and not be quite so prominent. It's an eternal trade-off with layers. You get a lot of control and a lot of cleanliness, but sometimes building it up in this way can feel a little bit fake and sterile, so we have to take some extra time and care to go back into our paintings at the very end and look for any ways that we can push them to feel a little bit more hand-painted. Thanks for watching and submitting your assignments. We have a much longer version of this critique video over at proko.com/digitalpainting, so if you're a premium student, go check it out. You can also find all the other lessons in the course there, so if you've missed any or want to watch through them again, be sure to take a look. And I'll see you in the next lesson.